to me, the human element is what is so crucial about all of life. And as we talk about business and finances, it's no different. Like, if you're putting the product or your business plan or even your policies over the human element of what you're doing, to me, it's just like ridiculously out of the lane. Like, if you don't have a focus on humans, it really does start to become, for me, a question of why you're doing things.
This is Pittsburgh, a place where a rich heritage of making things and a fierce, independent nature come together to create a thriving entrepreneurial community. Whether you're a small business owner looking for ideas or inspiration, or you're an enthusiastic supporter of local businesses, you'll find it here. I'm your host, Darin Vilano, and this is the Proprietors of Pittsburgh podcast. Today, my guest is TJ Fairchild, who's the owner of Commonplace Coffee. TJ, thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to have you as a guest.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Yeah. So I know that you started your business around 2003 here in Western Pennsylvania, but way before that, in the mid 90s, you were working in coffee shops and as you were going through college or whatever, you were working in coffee shops, you had that experience. What was it about that environment, working in a coffee shop and being around coffee culture? And, what was it that you fell in love with that would ultimately inspire you to build your own business? Maybe you didn't know that at the time, but what was it that inspired you and got you excited about being in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on it in your question. It was absolutely the culture and the surround of coffee in general. I was struggling kind of to find my path in life. And I remember the first time I walked into the coffee shop that stole my heart, Cup of Joe in Raleigh, North Carolina on Hillsborough Street. Walked in and there were three guys in the back with big instruments and big beards and the smell of coffee, and you could smoke in the coffee shops then, and the tobacco swirling and people reading and playing chess and having conversation. The whole thing just hit me to the core.
Mm-hmm. You ultimately started your business in the early 2000s here in Western Pennsylvania, as we talked about. And that was kind of early on, actually, for specialty coffee and specialty coffee roasting. Back then it wasn't the scene that it is today by far. You were probably one of the early companies, I would imagine, not maybe the first, but one of the early ones doing it in this part of the country, in this part of the state. What did it feel like back then? Did it feel like you were early? Did it feel like, obviously now the coffee culture has exploded and it probably feels like less of a risk, but back then you're early, you're on the cutting edge, you're a little bit of a pioneer doing this. Did it feel like that? Did it feel like you were doing something new and different and unique? Or did it feel less risky? Like, this is a foregone conclusion, this is going to really take off. How did it feel for you?
Well, number one, I just want to say you did your research. This is awesome. Like you invited us into a great part of the conversation. Yeah, we did feel like pioneers, but just, full vulnerability. We weren't as in tune with specialty coffee or what was named third wave coffee in 2004. We weren't tuned into that scene. Commonplace Coffee was very intentionally named because we love people, we love culture, we love atmosphere, we love community, and that was what drove Julie and I to open Commonplace Coffee. In 2003, when we opened, we still had tons to learn about coffee, specialty coffee in general, but very specifically third wave coffee. And I was so grateful to our early clientele that gave us a lot of freedom. There were definitely things about coffee that we were excited about. We'd both worked in cafes, we knew it. I'd even had some roasting experience before we opened Commonplace. But it wasn't until 2006 or 7 when we really started to appreciate some of the finer nuances of specialty coffee that was at that time transitioning to third wave coffee. And as we moved into the Pittsburgh area, because Commonplace started in Indiana, Pennsylvania, when we started moving into the Pittsburgh area, that was where we really felt as pioneers, because that was mid 2009 as we started to move in. there was very little kind of sensitivity to third wave coffee. There were a handful of shops that we loved to visit in Pittsburgh, but by and large, the cafe experience in Pittsburgh was not following that trend yet.
You brought up a good point there, which is, I picked up on something you had said, which is, when you were starting off, you didn't have all the answers. You didn't know everything yet. You were still,
absolutely not.
You were still figuring things out. And I think that's a good example for somebody who's listening to this right now, who is planning to start a business. It could be completely unrelated to coffee, but maybe they're starting a business, they're an entrepreneur, they're doing their research, they're doing their homework, they're planning a first location or whatever it is. Yeah. And I think one of the places where people get stuck is they think that you have to have it all figured out. You have to have it perfect. And I've heard so many people say what you just said, which is, sometimes you just have to go. You just have to, you have to have enough information. You don't want to be completely, unknowledgeable about what you're doing, but at some point you have to just go and learn as you go a little bit and have the confidence that you're going to continue to figure things out as you develop.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the only thing that I had going for me in 2003 was that I absolutely loved human beings. And my business acumen was low. My coffee acumen was moderate. But I have a desire to learn in all aspects of life. But at the base of it, humans were why we got into the business. Humans were exactly why we loved hiring and dealing with some of the difficulties and understanding how to be good bosses when we were early on. That was what we absolutely loved, was the human aspect. And you're absolutely right. Like, if I had taken coffee too seriously or business too seriously, it definitely would have put up roadblocks and hurdles that would have been difficult for me to pass. And I probably would have just sat and thought about this as a concept.
Especially business too seriously, because coffee was something that you loved, that you were passionate about. And the business side, as you just mentioned, was an area that you knew less about. It would have been very easy for somebody like you, and this happens all the time, for somebody to get fixated on that part they don't know as much about, or they don't feel as confident, and they feel like, well, I got to really learn all of this before I can do anything.
Totally.
And then years pass and time passes, and you sort of miss your opportunity. And I think you being early, even though you weren't right in Pittsburgh in 2003, but you were close. You probably had such a nice head start that by the time you got here, you were really, the wheels were in motion and you were moving. And had you put everything off for a while, you probably wouldn't be here, or at least at the size that you are today.
Definitely would have never moved to Pennsylvania for sure. And then I do want to kind of contradict myself a little bit and say that I don't want to underplay preparation.
Sure. Absolutely.
I've seen folks walk into the coffee business, apart from just roasteries, but also in cafes, with either a focus too much on style and over like investment in certain aspects of the coffee industry and lose, or I've seen folks kind of miss their ability to really do their research and understand and get in, and then they're over their head way too fast. So I don't want to underplay preparation, but it really was something that we evolved into rather than set out on a very specific path with exactly how we wanted Commonplace to look and show up with coffee execution.
Sure. That's a great point. So as we mentioned, way back when you opened that first location in Indiana, PA, what was it about that specific area that drew you to it? Was there a university vibe? Was it just a hole in the market that was underserved? What was it that brought you there?
And it's so hard to ask any origin question with Commonplace without couching it in the reality that I have no idea what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. We did not move to Indiana, Pennsylvania because we were on a search for Western Pennsylvania or that area. It came to us, just like 99% of everything that Commonplace has done. We received a phone call, Indiana, Pennsylvania, that turned into a road trip. And my wife and I were already living in our 1974 Volkswagen van, so road trip was easy. We show up in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and we're like, why in the world would we move here? And then we started to get to know the people. And we actually had a couple students that were so incredibly encouraging and obviously desirous of a place to build community and a place to gather and have coffee and discussion. So why Indiana, Pennsylvania? I have no idea. Why did Indiana, Pennsylvania want TJ and Julie is like the real question. Like we got the phone call,
Right.
like we didn't seek it out, but we're so grateful. I mean, we wanted to end up in the Northeast-ish. My wife is from Indiana State. I'm from Rhode Island. So, this is a good middle ground for us to be involved in our families.
Yeah, absolutely. So not long after you opened that first location in Indiana, you started to roast your own coffee. Now, why was it that you made that decision as opposed to doing what a lot of coffee shop owners do, especially new ones, which is, sell somebody else, another wholesaler's coffee? Obviously, you chose a different path, and it was fairly early on, as we'd mentioned, in that type of industry to do your own. What was behind that choice?
We started roasting months after we opened. That was something very important to me. A little bit was because of what we talked about a second ago with the coffee market moving and evolving. We were aware of things happening beyond just Western Pennsylvania, and we wanted to participate in those things. We wanted to use someone local when we did buy roasted coffee, so that was a goal. But we were dissatisfied with our choices in 2003 of what we could choose. What our options were. In Pittsburgh, we even looked as far west as Cleveland. We looked at some roasters that were in central PA at the time. So there was a desire to kind of get on the train of how coffee was evolving. But even more than that, I remember really like identifying with farmers and identifying with supply chain. And I just wanted to be more a part of the process. Like it was exciting to watch coffee change, whether that's just as an agricultural product or while it's in the roaster. That was really exciting to me. So I wanted to be more a part of the process.
Mm-hmm. And so as you kind of touched on this a little bit, the name Commonplace and what it means to you, kind of touched on that. I understand that it's inspired by a poem, Walt Whitman, right? Walt Whitman poem. Where did you come across that poem, or your wife come across that poem? How did it speak to you? What was it that struck a chord with you that you said, this has got to be the name? Or if we ever open up a business, this has got to be the name. What inspired that?
Yeah, so in college was like a big awakening for me intellectually. I mean, I cared about life. I was somewhat of an introspective person at some level before college, but when I went to the university, I really, something happened to me, and I fell in love with philosophy and literature at all aspects. And the first time I heard the name Walt Whitman was because of Cordelia Hanneman, one of my professors in undergrad. And she became kind of a personal mentor to me in a lot of ways. And Walt Whitman was such an interesting thinker for me because a lot of the other things that I was studying were fairly rigid, high-minded. And here this guy was just very simply looking at the world, finding truth, and repeating it beautifully. So he was always really important to me, and I wish I could take full credit for the name, but it was actually my wife who we started looking for names that were alliterating with coffee, and she reminded me of the poem "The Commonplace" in Leaves of Grass, and it just hit us perfectly. I mean, we're kind of weirdos in a lot of ways, and we're relatively skeptical of a lot of things, which is in the poem, where we homeschool our children. We're a little crazy, and that poem really does remind at where we can find growth, where we can find truth, where we can find introspection beyond just the ways that we always find them. So it really struck a chord.
I think it's interesting too that your background and interest was in journalism and literature. and poetry even, and you ended up in the coffee business, which has some similarities in the sense that, when you think of the, quintessential coffee shop, it evokes that feeling of,
Oh, yes.
of reading and quiet and yes, a buzz sometimes too in the neighborhood of
totally.
a conversation or a place to gather on a Saturday afternoon. And it's interesting that that's what you do, given your background and your interest. I mean, they do go together.
Yeah, like one of the earliest names of coffee houses in England was penny universities, and that strikes a chord as well. That just this kind of what seemed to be a path of more high-minded academic philosophy took this turn into everyday, normal, real-life philosophy through a coffee shop experience. It's beautiful.
And I didn't know that about England. And so it seems like an early coffee shop would have held a similar place as an early pub, kind of a gathering place.
Totally, yeah.
Sort of that same kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know how much beer was a part of those early coffee houses, but definitely was pubbish, and that's where a lot of intellect, or not even just intellectual discussion, but also political discussion would happen. And I love that. I celebrate that. I want people to disagree, and I want people to be weird and meet someone that they don't always interact with. That to me is what the coffee culture does, is it really does bring a common denominator of humanity to play. And I've seen people that would never have had an interaction in the same way in a coffee house be able to talk and find similarity.
There's something civilized about it, that you come together and you have discussion, and it's not, it's in a normal tone, and it's intellectual.
And there's not much at stake. Like, you can disagree with someone in a coffee house and leave and shake hands. There's nothing that's going to, you're not going to hold a big liability as you leave.
And it becomes a place to share ideas and to feel safe to come there with your ideas. Speaking of the role coffee shops play, you have 7 or 8 coffee shops in a bakery now. Is that right?
Correct.
And I think the really cool thing about coffee shops is that you're ingrained in the neighborhood. So you're embedded, you're in the culture of what's happening in that neighborhood. You're a place where people are coming, as we had talked about, to share ideas, to gather. What do you guys do in terms of, and you're influencing the culture in the neighborhood inside your store, but what are you doing outside of your store as well? What types of things do you do to engage the community, to meet the community, to support, whether it's organizations or people in the neighborhoods that you're in outside of the coffee shop? Are you volunteering for things, or supporting for things, or supporting your employees as they volunteer?
Absolutely. I mean, that's key to what we're about. Julie and I are very active in our community. We still live in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and sadly it's difficult for us to get to Pittsburgh as much as we want to. But we have been so ridiculously gifted with each of our managers at each one of the stores has a heart for their community and has a heart for understanding what happens outside of their walls, and what they can do to enrich that area through either the work in the coffee house or ways that we can give back. Sometimes we're sending something as simple as coffee finished brewed to an organization. Sometimes we're actually able to donate funds in response to certain things that are happening. So we absolutely love the community beyond just the walls.
And speaking of your locations, it seems that most of them have come about not through planning, but sort of organically or spontaneously, if you will, opportunities that have arisen. One that stands out to me specifically is Velato. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because what's interesting about that location, if anybody doesn't know, is it was another coffee shop before you took it over. And it seems that you were very thoughtful about how you guys went about that. You were respectful of the customers that knew and loved that location, the people that had already worked at that location. You even incorporated the name into your name. These are things that not everybody would do if they took over another location. It really stood out to me. Could you tell me a little bit more about the thought process there and what went into that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just like we said a second ago, Indiana, Pennsylvania called on us. And that's how we started Commonplace. And similarly, each of our locations is in response to some beckoning. Velato, you bring up a great story, because Velato is another example of this. The original owners, Barb and Emily, that opened Velato, they were some of the early trendsetters in Pittsburgh coffee. They opened in 2009, and they were doing coffee at a national level that very few others, there were a few others, but very few others in Pittsburgh were. That neighborhood is very interesting. It was in some ways not ready for what Barb and Emily had to offer that neighborhood. So it had quite a bit of time to invest in. After 3 years or so, they decided to go back to their original careers, and they invited us in to take over. And it was absolutely important to us through the process to honor what they did. We did put a coffee brewer in. They didn't do drip coffee. That everything was manual for American style coffee. But we did try to honor other methods of manual brewing, their style of espresso. We even tried to keep, they used 49th Parallel coffee from Vancouver. We tried to keep that going, and that did not work out very well. It was a very difficult proposition. We tried to incorporate the staff in the transition. And that's very important to us. We don't want to walk into a coffee shop, or more importantly, the neighborhood, and try to not be present and aware of what is happening already in those spaces. It's really important to us to be a part of the community and not change it to something it's not, or try to force some position we have on that neighborhood. We want to be involved, and we want to serve them. We don't want to I don't know what the opposite of serve is. You can lead in a service style, but anyway.
Several years ago, you purchased a farm that serves as your bakery, where you provide goods for your shops, I'm assuming. Now, there was a little bit of a departure, right, from what you were doing, because you're roasting coffee, you're wholesaling, you're selling through other coffee shops and retailers. You're also operating your own shops. This is it's not totally different, but it's a bit of a departure from what you were currently doing at the time. How big of a risk did that feel like you were taking? What was the conversation like in your, whether between your wife or within your team, to take that on? It's a farm outside of Indiana, Pennsylvania, for anybody that's listening. And I know you had a history with it, because that was a place that provided you with goods at one time, right?
Man, again, your research is awesome.
Oh, thank you. So what was the thank you. So what was the thought process there that went into that purchase?
Yeah, just one subtle correction there. We didn't purchase it. We are just renting.
Sure. Thank you.
But no problem. I just, would feel weird to kind of forget that part.
Sure.
But it was an absolute risk for us. It was something I'd always talked about, like fearing food, because I never worked in a restaurant in the sense of understanding inventory and shelf life of goods. Coffee is very forgiving from that aspect. Coffee has a wide shelf life, so
and it doesn't have to be kept at temperature, and there's a lot of other.
Yeah, it won't make anyone sick.
Sure.
So it was scary. We love this family. The family that this farm has been a part of for generations is they're close to our hearts. They were friends that we made early on in coming to Indiana, and as you pointed out, they provided baked goods for our shop in Indiana for years. When they made the decision to close the shop, I always wanted to figure out something to do with. It's a bakehouse. It's also a dining room. At one point, it served as a full restaurant from later in the morning to early afternoon. And then they also do a festival for
like a fall festival?
I was going to say Thanksgiving, before Thanksgiving, Halloween, a fall festival with, they grow pumpkins, and there's hay rides, and just it hits on all of the things that I love. Community building, children having fun, a reason to get together, to get us out of our houses. I loved it. So I always wanted to be a part of doing something there. Was super freaked out about getting into food. But thankfully I had a team of folks, primarily led by Carrie Meal, who has been an absolute wonderful friend since we've moved to Western Pennsylvania. And she has piloted this program, and she has managed this for us since its inception. And she's done a fantastic job. It's a tough thing as a coffee house to source pastries. It's a bizarre proposition. I don't know why. We have struggled with that from the beginning. We use some great purveyors.
So this really solves a real issue then too.
It does, yeah. I mean, from like what items you want to when they show up, how do you store those items so that they're the freshest?
Consistency too.
It's really tough, yeah. So now we have control over shelf life. We have control over what items we want. We have control over pairings. And Carrie does a fantastic job, and her team, of finding local ingredients. Often in the summers, we're buying things from Indiana, Pennsylvania's farmers market. Sometimes we're trying to even grow things ourselves on the farm because we have access to some greenhouse and some land there to actually grow. So, it hits all the buttons that are exciting to Commonplace.
That's great. Now, most people are going to know Commonplace for your coffee first and foremost, whether it's through a wholesale channel, like through somebody else's shop, or through buying a bag of the coffee, or through your own stores. But what a lot of people don't know is the role that you guys have played in consulting and advising and helping other coffee shop owners get started. And because that's a little bit more B2B, people aren't going to be as aware of that. So I'm curious, you've been in business for a lot of years now. Do you even have an idea of how many shops you've helped start? And what does it feel like for you to see somebody realize their entrepreneurial dream, to open the door for the first time, and that you were part of that process of helping them launch?
Yeah, it's been a strange evolution for me personally, going from single cafe ownership, being in a coffee shop behind the bar for several hours a day, to then balancing that with roasting, and then balancing those things with owning multiple cafes. Very early on, as we started roasting coffee, we got phone calls from folks that wanted us to partner with their existing coffee shops. The earliest from inception coffee house that we helped was a group of monks from St. Vincent's College, and we had a fantastic experience. And I woke up one morning and I was like, oh, this is going to be my life now. My life is going to be helping others and supporting their coffee dreams. And it's been absolutely beautiful. I love spending time with folks that have a dream of coffee. And if we can help fill in the blanks on some of how they bring that to execution, it's completely life-giving to me.
Now, a little bit ago, we talked about that VW bus. And I know that's an important part of your background, important part of your life, probably a lot of memories for you. Is there, and I know you were taking road trips and probably doing a lot of things, including stopping in other cafes, but is there any funny story or any memorable story for that matter that stands out to you in that time period of your life that you guys were doing? Is there anything that stands out that you could
just
share?
Coffee related, or
could be anything? Could be anything. Yeah.
Well, the first thing I think of is how much of a struggle it was to get good coffee. I mean, we did interact with a few great ones along that journey. But I had worked most recently with Caribou Coffee, and I had a lot of stale Caribou coffee in my bus that we would make on a stovetop mocha pot. Right. So our coffee, was not that great along that journey. We had a lot to learn. I think the thing that's so fascinating to me is kind of looking inward to my own personality during that trip. This probably will be meaningless to most people, but just in case it isn't, and it is meaningful. I struggled a lot on our road trip. I struggled a lot with understanding, we had saved money. We were fine. We had money in the bank. We knew what we were doing, and we kind of had a plan for one day we will get jobs again. But I really struggled to be fully in that moment. And I was overcome. And, one day that I always think of with my wife, I joke about, we're boondocking in Newfoundland, and we're in the middle of the amazing hikes, amazing like precipices over the ocean, and I'm worried about jobs and money and what I'm gonna do. And there were times where I'd like let Julie go on a hike by herself or let her enjoy an overlook, and I'm like crippled in the van trying to figure out what my life was gonna be like. And I look back on those moments just so sad. I didn't enjoy those moments more. Why was I so concerned and worried or thoughtful for the future? I don't know. I wish I could
look
go
how great
back
it
then,
turned out, and it's,
I know, right? I wish I could have just gone back. And that's good for my daily life too. I mean, I struggle with things, normal course of business, normal days. And I really, I wish I could just be in the moment, realizing that it's going to work out, that not to get confused by the details or overwhelmed by them, work as hard as you can, and then let it happen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautiful advice. And speaking of advice, as we wrap up here, what are your final thoughts and advice for entrepreneurs out there, people that want to start their own business? It doesn't have to be coffee. It could be anything. They're just starting or they're getting ready to start. What things would you like to share if you could tell that person something? It could be also maybe lessons that you've learned or things that you wish you would have known. What things come to mind for you?
Really, the thing that I can see from experience watching other business owners is really surrounding yourself with good people, whether it's your team or advisors or even just your hires. Like that, to me, the human element is what is so crucial about all of life. And as we talk about business and finances, it's no different. Like if you're putting the product or your business plan or even your policies over the human element of what you're doing, to me, it's just like ridiculously out of the lane. Like if you don't have a focus on humans, it really does start to become, for me, a question of why you're doing things. Because I do regret that I didn't study business more and I didn't understand some basic accounting. It gets me in trouble all the time. I make errors that our bookkeeper and our accountants are slapping my wrists over. So I do love that. And I think it's incredibly important to understand your craft or whatever it is that you're putting your hand to. But I always go back to the human element, and the cultivation of those relationships cannot be more important than anything else.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. I think it's pretty evident in all the stories that you related here and a lot of things that you've said, just how important people are to you and to the equation. It seems like you really do get it in terms of, that's
where value is with life. I mean, it's hard, it's tiring, it's confusing, but to me, that's where life is.
Yeah, absolutely. TJ, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks a lot for involving us.
Absolutely. Take care.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please do me and the Pittsburgh small business community a huge favor by giving it a rating on your favorite podcast app. It really helps others to find the show so that we can continue to build our community. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. And if you know someone who should be on the podcast or you'd like to connect with me, you can reach me at proprietorsofpittsburgh.com or at 412-336-8247. I'm Darin Vilano, and this is the Proprietors of Pittsburgh podcast. Take care.